Hi, hello. Hi, everyone. It feels, I've never been in this room. I only saw it in like posters or things. So it's nice to actually see it for real. So nice to meet you. My name is Elena Giusti. I am an associate professor of Latin here in the department. And my expertise is on Augustan literature, mostly. I teach both Latin language and literature modules and Greek language modules as well. But yeah, as I said, I have an expertise especially in Augustan literature and especially very canonical stuff, especially on Virgil's Aeneid. So I guess that this is why I am here to talk about World of the Hero on the Latin side. I wrote a book on Virgil's Carthage, or Carthage in the Augustan age more broadly. It's called Carthage in Virgil's Aeneid. But it's a little bit of a deceptive title, I think. And I'm currently writing a book on Dido for, I'm hoping for a public engagement audience. So I'm really hoping to target students and teachers and amateurs of the ancient world as well, so not just academics. So I would be very happy to hear what your experiences are about teaching Dido in the Aeneid and this episode of the Aeneid. So that is what I'm going to talk about a little bit today. So I'll try to talk for like 40 minutes, and I would really like to have a little bit of a Q&A, and I think you must have all very different experiences in schools, so I'd really like to hear from you about this topic. I called it World of the Heroine. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm trying to talk today about think together about what appeals there could be with Dido for young students. And I think Dido is a character who can speak of feminist interests. Obviously, when we talk about feminism, there's so many different feminisms, so I'm going to touch a little bit about this as well in the lecture. But she also speaks to issues of, now it's very much a buzzword, right, intersectionality, because she is also a Semitic queen who is at the same time an African queen in many respects. She's quite a unique character, actually, in antiquity in being, you know, the general, in the sense of her people, so a woman who founds a city, travels, just like Aeneas does, right, from the east of the Mediterranean to found this city in North Africa. And she's quite unique in that. I don't know how many of you know this. I will be touching upon this, but she had her own tradition. That is not the story that Virgil tells us. According to her own tradition, Dido never met Aeneas. We don't know when this fiction was fabricated. It may have been Virgil. It may have been, some scholars believe, a poet called Naevius, who wrote a poem on the First Punic War and who was a veteran of the First Punic War before him. But it's quite clear that it's created in order to create a cause for, to explain the enmity between Rome and Carthage afterwards. So she also, I think, speaks of issues of appropriation or a kind of elision of her own history. So she has been a character who has interested post-colonial thinkers and post-colonial authors as well. So I think that she does have a lot of potential to speak of issues that may interest our students nowadays. So when we talk about kind of tackling like ways of thinking or approaching these ancient texts with a feminist lens, is obviously it's a difficult thing to do in a sense, because there is a kind of a well-known double bind with feminist literature. There are, feminist readings of literature. There are, generally speaking, we say that there are two main modes of reading these texts with a feminist lens. We can say that one of them is recuperative, and the other one is damning. So the recuperative mode tries to kind of read the ancient, make the female characters, or, you know, it applies to feminism, but obviously can apply to other marginalized groups as well. So reading female characters in the epics as the subjects and kind of using these texts to see things from their eyes, in a sense. And the other one is condemning, so it's kind of exposing the patriarchal asset of the texts, exposing the ways in which the text eventually contributes to the oppression of marginalized groups. Both of them can be critiqued, clearly, so that is why I'm saying it's a double bind. There's no way of winning in this, because if the recuperative mode is often criticized for being very naive or naively positivistic. I mean, why would you try to recover female-authored voices in texts that were written by, well, now we would say white, obviously they weren't white in antiquity, but male authors. And what can you think can be recuperated from that? The other one is, in a sense, is also criticized for sort of contributing actually to this, to exposing this oppression. Often this is made when you probably don't touch themes like rape, perhaps in classical civilization, but when I teach, for instance, the Metamorphoses of Ovid, it's very difficult not to talk about it. So rape is one of those cases when sometimes if you put the accent on it too much, it can look as if you're fetishizing, you're re-eroticizing it, and you're making it even worse for victims. So there are, I think, downsides to both approaches in a sense. And together with my colleague, Professor Victoria Reimel, in 2019, we chaired a symposium in Cuma, which is the annual Symposium Cumanum for Virgilian Studies. And we dedicated it to the topic of Virgil and the feminine. And then we edited an issue which now has 10 essays in it on the topic. I must say none of them actually on Dido. One of them touches a little bit on Dido, but because Dido has been studied so much as a topic. But there is an introduction where we go into some of the literature beforehand, which also includes Dido, includes Lavinia, for instance. And this is something that we tackle, and we see this as very important also for us for thinking about what do we do with classics, because if you want to look at feminist approaches, you'd rather read other texts. How can we make a claim for classicists actually, classical texts to actually have to tell us something about this as well, or something to teach us also in the history of their receptions and in the history of their critical history of scholarship. So when we come to Dido in particular, you may have noticed that she's not like other characters of antiquity who had a feminist rewriting in a sense. I mean, when I read personal statements from students, they often cite Madeleine Miller, for instance, Circe, but we can also think of Christa Wolf with Cassandra or Medea. But Dido, in a sense, hasn't really appealed much to feminist interests, and many students, I think, don't like her. So, and in a sense, some of it goes back to this quotation from famous feminist thinker Hélène Cixous, when she writes that, she may empathize with Dido, but Dido kind of embodies this sort of victimhood that goes against the kind of feminist project that she had in mind, and this was in the 70s. But I think that some of these issues of Dido being this victimized, passive character continue to hinder her reception or her appeal for feminist pursuits. This is very recent, actually it just came out. It's a novel on Dido it's actually an author and a school teacher, an Italian school teacher, Marilu Oliva, who wrote this Aeneid of Dido, in which, I don't want to spoil it too much, but basically her take is that Dido ends up inadvertently killing Aeneas, and she becomes Aeneas instead of him. She pretends that she is Aeneas, and so the whole second half of the Aeneid is Dido instead of him. And some of it is really interesting because it kind of works on things that scholars have noticed for a long time, the similarity between Dido and Aeneas as sort of almost twins, both in their stories, but also some of you remember they are compared in similes. One is compared to Apollo, one is to Diana, so they're kind of almost twin figures. So she's kind of playing with that. But obviously in the Aeneid, Dido, in this Aeneid, the Aeneid of Dido, Dido is never in love with Aeneas. She kind of has a one-night stand in the cave. She is in love with Ilioneus for reasons that I cannot comprehend, but anyway. But there is like this quote that I got because I thought it was similar to, to Hélène Chissoul's take on, how come everyone else bought this fable. I think this is Dido speaking when she meets Palinurus in the underworld, because she's kind of Aeneas. The fable of the suffering queen who threw herself onto a sword just because Aeneas had walked away from her when she had experienced much worse, that she wouldn't just kill herself for a man abandoning her. So on the one hand, there is this, this lack of appeal of Dido for sort of strong women feminism, we can say. But on the other hand, there have been ways in which Dido has been used to actually, in modern literature, or I'll show you an example of actually music reception, to highlight the vulnerabilities of being a woman in patriarchal societies. One obvious example, well, maybe not so obvious, but it's a famous example, I think, if you have read the tetralogy of Elena Ferrante, My Brilliant Friend. Dido is a character who comes back again and again as a figure for the abandoned woman, but also the woman who is made to become crazy out of this. Not just because she's abandoned by men, but because by society, by impositions of society, she becomes dependent upon men. And she becomes, and it's quite clear, I think, that Elena Ferrante has read Virgil very closely. There is this quotation that I got in which Dido becomes a sort of almost ancestral shadow for all the mad women, all like kind of lines or kind of trees of mad women. And she becomes a shadow of all these female ancestors and their repressed anger, basically. And the fact that she uses the word shadow like that, I think, is a pointer, because maybe some of you remember Dido herself calls herself a shadow. She says to Aeneas, I will follow you like a shadow, I will be your shadow. And we may also argue that she is somewhere at the end of the Aeneid, when that's the last word of the Aeneid, by the way, right? The shadows into which the soul of Turnus goes. So she fulfills a very different aim, I think, for Elena Ferrante. And another kind of similar case is the songwriter Laura Marling, who she gave her title to an album from 2017. She gave the title from a line of the Aeneid, which you may or may not know. It's a famous line. So she called it Semper Femina. So this is the passage of the Aeneid that is a famously misogynistic passage. This is Mercury, who tells Aeneas to leave Carthage because he thinks that Dido is stirring up she's planning some sort of terrible Carthaginian perfidious thing. And he says, well, the woman is always a fickle and a changeable thing, and the Latin is really important there, because you have the Latin varium et mutabile. They are both neuter. So, we're talking about an object, not something that is gendered there. And then femina is enjambed, is in the following line, and it stands alone together as this sort of entity that neither Mercury nor Aeneas really manages to recognize. They have to kind of understand as she's kind of the ultimate other, I think, there in the line. And what Laura Marling does, which I think is really clever, she takes away the enjambment. She puts semper and femina together, as a way to say, you know, this is me deciding to impersonate myself as a woman subject. And it's really interesting what she says about writing the album, because she says she started writing it imagining her own experiences as a woman, as if she was a man writing about a woman, which is something that often happens in a sense because a lot of the songwriting or the novels are written by men writing about women. So even women sometimes find it hard to get into these traditions of where we can talk about écriture féminine, basically. And then she says, oh, I had like this moment of intuition that I didn't need to pretend that I was a man to talk about my intimacy. And it's interesting that she chooses to kind of own this misogynistic quotation from the Aeneid, which has otherwise a very long reception. You can think of, there's a famous aria from Rigoletto, the woman is mobile, the woman is changeable, like a feather in the wind, etc. So she's kind of rethinking that sort of thing. So as I said, there are different ways, I think, in which Dido can be made to work to appeal or to not to appeal to feminist receptions. Some of this has been studied by the scholarship. I think a very important book in this respect is this book by Marilyn Desmond called Reading Dido, which, however, is not on the Aeneid, but it's on the medieval reception of Aeneid, and she puts a lot of emphasis actually on Christine de Pisan for kind of woman writing about Dido. And she kind of argues for a move away from Virgil in order to recover, in a sense, Dido in a feminist sense, but also in a post-colonial sense. So she goes back to the Dido tradition that I'll say a few things about in a moment, and to how the medieval tradition, that tradition of the Dido who kills herself on a funeral pyre in order not to remarry, the Dido who never meets Aeneas, why that is appealing to medieval readers. And we'll see that that is also appealing to the Christian church fathers, partly because perhaps they were North African, but also obviously because he was an example of chastity. So for Marilyn Desmond, in her introduction to the book, Dido actually speaks of both feminist and post-colonial concerns at the same time, but she's asking this sort of move away from the Aeneid in order to recognize that. And these are just some examples of how Dido has, in fact, then appealed to not just to Tunisian literature, but this is the other Dido, not the Virgilian Dido. So, for instance, Fazim Allah's book, Elissa la Reine Vagabonde, it's the wandering Dido that I will tell you about, the Dido of the historical tradition. But also, she's been used as a symbol for, she and Carthage, a symbol for other post-colonial contexts, as Carthage as a symbol of resistance to Roman imperialism, which becomes a symbol of resistance to Western imperialism more generally. So the story of the other Dido, I think the earliest attestation that we have is by the historian Timaeus, who is often cited on his own, but it's interesting that this excerpt comes from a very interesting treatise that is quite difficult to date, perhaps in between, but we don't know really, first century BC or first century CE perhaps. And it's a treatise on women famous in wars. It's kind of a list of women, among which Dido is also, of kind of warlike women, among which she appears. And Timaeus calls her Teiosso in Greek, which seems to explain her original Semitic name, Elissa. El is some sort of divinity, so Theos in Greek should translate that. And he says that that was her Phoenician name. He tells us that she was the sister of Pygmalion, the king of Tyre, that her husband was killed by Pygmalion. You may have read about this in the Aeneid. And then she put all her possessions of her husband on board, and she fled with some of the citizens, and she came to Libya. And then she was called Dido. he says, by the Africans because of her extensive wanderings. So he gives this etymology of Dido as the wandering queen, which is also hinted at in the Aeneid. There is a moment when Iarbas talks about Dido. I don't have it in the slides, I think, but he calls her femina errans. So errans has the Latin for wandering. But it's interesting that Timaeus tells us that this was her African name, as if there were like these two different personalities. Now, generally, scholars think that Dido probably has a Semitic root, but we don't really know. So as if she has like these two possible identities, in a sense. And then he tells us that she refused to marry a local king, and she pretended she built up a pyre pretending that she had to solve the oaths to her dead husband, and instead she killed herself on it. It's also interesting that he says that she was pressured by the citizens to marry, so we kind of feel a sense that she was not, as a woman leader, she probably wasn't as free as she, she probably just wasn't free to do whatever she wanted to do. So there was some pressure from the citizens. And such pressure continues actually in the account of Justin. So Justin is writing a summary of the histories of a certain Pompeius Trogus. And it is really important that Pompeius Trogus is writing at the same time of Virgil. So we know that Virgil knew of this other story of Dido. Although we don't have Pompeius Trogus in full, it's quite clear that Virgil knows what he is doing when he's not relating this story. And Justin's account is longer and more detailed than Trogus's. And Justin here tells, it's clear also that there is an element of Punic stereotype, both for Dido and for the local Carthaginians, and there is also an element of stereotyping the local Africans as savage, I think, in this excerpt in particular. So the Carthaginians trick Elissa in agreeing to marry the local king. I'm not gonna read the text, but I can give it to Paul to give it to you afterwards if you need it. And then she tricks them in turn in pretending to... So this aspect of the trickstery of Dido is much more emphasized, as is the aspect of the savage characters, kind of the uncultivated characters of the locals. So as I said, Macrobius tells us that everyone knew that the story told by Virgil was false. In fact, there are around 370 years of difference in the traditional chronologies between the fall of Troy and the foundation of Carthage. So many readers would have recognized this as a complete fantasy, although some scholars think, and I think I'm among them, that this probably wasn't invented completely by Virgil, but it was already present in the mid-Republican epics, or it was present in Naevius. But it's still clear that Virgil knows what he's doing. And as I said, the story of the disbelief in Virgil's story continues already in antiquity. And in particular, in the Church Fathers, I have these two excerpts are from Tertullian and Augustine, so both North Africans. Tertullian in particular is interested in highlighting the character of chastity for Dido. This will also be important in the Renaissance reception of Dido. And in this passage of the De Exhortatione Castitatis, which I didn't report in full, he actually joins her with Lucrezia. So he sees a similarity between Dido and Lucrezia there. Whereas Augustine is a little bit, in the Confessions, he says many times that he was crying as a young man when reading about Dido, even though he knew that this was wrong, and that he was wrong because this was falsehood, and he was wrong because his mind was wandering away from God. And it's interesting that there seems to be a sort of empathy between Augustine and Dido, so both as the wandering people, but also both as perhaps North African North African people. And here elsewhere he says that any learned person would know very well that this is all falsehood, this is all a fiction. And obviously for him it's all a matter of pitting it against the true literature of the scriptures. And as I said, in the Renaissance, it's interesting that there are basically two schools on Dido, which sometimes even become like they set themselves one against the other precisely on the character of Dido. So this is a clear example in a sort of intertextual relationship between Dante and Petrarch. So Dante obviously follows Virgil. Dante has Dido in the underworld, and he doesn't name her, but it's quite clear who she is. He names Psycheus. He calls her she who killed herself for love and who broke her faith to the ashes of Psycheus. Whereas Petrarch, on the other hand, he says in his triumph of Pudicitia, so kind of triumph of chastity, he says that the ignorant common, among which we may read Dante himself, should just stay silent because Dido actually killed herself by the pursuit of honesty and not by vain love. And she becomes a model, either a model for women, like so the chaste Dido becomes a model for Renaissance women to keep their chastity, whereas the other Dido, the Virgilian Dido, becomes an anti-model for women, so the luxurious queen not to follow. So both Didos can actually be used for very patriarchal purposes in a sense, but they, even though they're kind of opposite in their history. And the fact that Virgil knew what he was doing, I think, is clear by his inserting this character of Fama right in the middle of his book, of this Dido book. So this Fama is represented, Fama is both rumor and gossip, but she's also fame, she's also literally fame. She's represented as a monster who can destroy cities, and obviously she destroys Carthage and she destroys Dido, and she mixes fact and fiction in equal parts. So there's plenty of scholarship actually on how Fama is kind of a model for what Virgil himself is doing in the Aeneid, but also for an anticipation for the fame that Virgil hopes he will derive from this daring enterprise. And people who emphasize that probably it was Virgil who put Dido and Aeneas together put a lot of emphasis on the character of Fama to buttress their claims. This is something that's a bit nerdy that I'm really fond of, however, and I call the riddle of the Septima Aestas. And there is also, there's a famous inconsistency in the Aeneid as well, that at the end of the first book, Dido tells Aeneas, this is the 7th summer since the destruction of Troy that you are here on these shores. And then we kind of get the sense that he spends 1 year with the queen. We get this sense because Anchises probably died just before he set out for, well, he didn't set out for Carthage, obviously, he set out for Italy, but then he was sent to Carthage. And in Book 5, when we have the funeral games in honor of Anchises, those are the games to honor him 1 year after his death. So clearly 1 year has passed from the death of Anchises. But then in Book 5, sorry, this went on, but then in Book 5, we're also told this line of Book 5 by Iris, who is disguised as Beroe to incite the Trojan women to set fire to the ship. Again, that this is the 7th summer since the destruction of Troy. And we also know that he spent the winter with the queen, and this is a really difficult line because winter, the Latin word is hiemes, can mean winter, but it can also mean a stormy season. And also this is the reports of Fama. So this may be, you know, one of those inconsistencies that Virgil would have amended had he completed the poem, so we may not care about it. But I like the idea that Virgil inserted it to kind of create this sense that, you know, this was all a fiction. It never really happened. He just went on, you know, North Africa, and this was a sort of ghost world. You know, the Carthage would only happen 370 years later or whatever. So I insert these two different chronologies in there to just mess you up. So that's my take, which not everyone obviously believes, but I thought that I would add it. Obviously, Virgil had read about the passage that we understand more, where we, just checking the time, where we mostly understand that he is aware of the other tradition, is this background story of Dido, that we shouldn't forget is addressed by Venus to Aeneas. And we can think that it is actually quite bented against Dido for a number of reasons that I'll probably say more in a moment. And this is the bit in which we have the famous phrase, the dux femina. So Dido, a leader woman of the enterprise. It's a statement without a verb. The leader of the enterprise, a woman. And it's quite unclear. Scholars are very divided. Since antiquity, actually, the ancient commentators also didn't know whether this femina was derogatory or not. Femina in itself is not a derogatory term, although Mercury uses it, as we have seen, in a derogatory term. It definitely, all the ancient commentators, Servius, for instance, it says that this definitely adds an element of surprise on Venus's part. But yeah, there is no sisterhood, I think, between Venus and Dido. So, she's not claiming, but then the phrase itself, dux femina, has actually been used to make a sense for this uniqueness of Dido as a female leader of her people. And so I wanted, in the time that hopefully remains to me a little bit, I just wanted to add something about the extent to which, so as I said something about Dido as having an appeal for feminist readers, but obviously Dido can also speak of issues of ethnicity, and I may talk about this in the Q&A if you are interested, and also kind of anachronistically race in antiquity. And one way in which she does is because, at least since this was quite a game changer article in the critical reception of Dido by Nicholas Horsfall in 1973, in which against all the commentators who seem to agree that we side with Dido in the Aeneid, he kind of made the very strong case that if you were a Roman reader, you would recognize throughout the Aeneid that there are traces of anti-Carthaginian hatred. There are traces of stereotypes of Carthaginians. Some of the arguments that he uses, I think, are not particularly convincing. So, for instance, he says that everything that Dido does that is treacherous becomes a symbol of Carthaginian treachery. So Carthaginians definitely had a stereotype for untrustworthiness. There was such a thing called as punica fides, so Punic faith was a thing, so we know that there was this stereotype. There was a stereotype for greed, and as he said, for violence. Greed also because they were merchant people. The stereotypes, I think, not everyone agrees, but it can be traced up to the stereotypes of the Phoenicians in the Odyssey as well, because partly they are merchants. Duplicity, hatred. Again, hatred is not really a stereotype, I think, but whatever. And so, for instance, he says that even the faith that she doesn't keep to the dead husband is a trait of that, which I find not particularly convincing. Or the fact that Mercury thinks that she is plotting to set fire to the ships is a stereotype for treachery, but that's what Mercury thinks. That's not necessarily what Dido is doing. So, I mean, and then I'll just, and another, one of the passages that he uses to base his argument on is precisely this passage, but he's not kind of making a claim. He's using it as if this was the narrator speaking. And I think that what is interesting that is the three passages where we can actually see this stereotype at work are all passages that are focalized or spoken by pro-Roman divinities, and especially Venus. So that's what I'm wondering about. To what extent are these stereotypes used onto her, kind of just like her own history has been changed and she has been, you know, it has been completely overturned for other purposes, kind of pro-Roman purposes. So Horsfall claims that there is a lot of emphasis in this passage on gold, on greed, on duplicity, obviously Pygmalion, but also the trick that she uses at the end of the passage to basically steal the soil from the local inhabitants. So all of these kind of can betray a sense of how duplicitous or how treacherous the Carthaginians are. Hello. Hi. And other passages, so I said something about intersectionality before. So intersectionality is important, I think, to keep in mind in this respect, because some of the passages where she is duplicitous, like the one that we saw before in Mercury, that she is varium et mutabile, may depend both on her being a Carthaginian and on her being a woman. So there is a moment in which the two stereotypes of being both a Carthaginian and a woman merge, and we can't really recognize the difference between the two. So that's when I think thinking with intersectionality, perhaps, in the background may be helpful. So this is one, for instance, these are some of the passages that Horsfall uses to make his claims. So when she says, I've not kept my promise to the ashes of Sychaeus, non servata fides, readers may read, well, of course, punica fides. Or when she says to herself, couldn't I have done all of these terrible things? Couldn't I have seized Aeneas' body, torn it apart, and scattered it in the waves? Which, by the way, is a quotation of Medea scattering her own brother's, Apsyrtus's body in the waves. Couldn't I have killed his companions with the sword and Ascanius himself and put him on his father's table for him to banquet on? And here she is clearly behaving like a Procne who did that to her son Itys, although incidentally Procne is Athenian, so there isn't the sense of kind of course her husband Tereus is a barbarian, he's a Thracian, so there is something going on there with stereotypes, but perhaps more complicated than Horsfall would make it. And the other passages, so I think this is the most clear passage where stereotypes are at work. So this is Venus, who decides to plot against, in Book 1, she decides to plot against Dido and to send her son Cupid in the form of Ascanius for her to fall in love with Aeneas. And she does it because, obviously, because she fears this untrustworthy household and the two-tongued Tyrians. And the Latin is quite interesting there because quippe is a word that means that kind of because, but it has a sense of obvious. Clearly because obviously she would fear this household. Ambiguum is really itself an ambiguous word. We can say untrustworthy, but it's a difficult word actually to translate. And the Tyrians are called bilingues, which in Latin means technically that they speak more than one language, but it also means that they are deceitful. In itself, it's not only attached to Carthaginians, also the Ligurians are bilingues, for instance, in the Aeneid. They were said to be mendacious. And it's quite close to the stereotypes that we can find, for instance, in a play by Plautus, The Little Carthaginian, in Latin, the Poenulus, which clearly has anti-Carthaginian stereotypes. And this is a passage of the slave Milphio, who is addressing this character, Hanno, who is both bilingual, well, he's polyglot actually, and said to be like a snake, kind of treacherous. So he says, you have a two-forked tongue, like a creeping beast. So again, this is clearly a passage that is playing with expectations, at least definitely in the audience as well, in the readership of the poem, that the Carthaginians are treacherous, but I think that the text itself doesn't necessarily then agree or doesn't necessarily support those expectations. And a similar passage is earlier when Mercury is sent by Jupiter so that the Carthaginians would put aside their ferocia corda, their fierce hearts. And again, this is a very ambiguous passage because the word ferocia, the word ferox, the adjective ferox, can mean, for horseful, this means ferocious, savage, but it's also used for like Venus in Aeneid 10. It's a word that is often used. It's used in Livy for Romans to denote a warlike and courageous spirit. So it can be both a negative and a positive word. And there may be here a deliberate ambiguity, but we definitely know that at least Jupiter or Mercury and perhaps the readership would expect the Carthaginians to be unwelcoming towards the Trojans. And so they have to act beforehand. Okay. One last thing that I wanted to just flag is that, so I've talked about the potential stereotyping of Dido in the Aeneid, but there is also, on the other hand, something that is less remarked upon, is that Dido herself seems to stereotype the local people. As I said, and the local people are normally stereotyped as savage. So on the one hand, Dido says that she will not discriminate between Trojans and Tyrians, but she seems to imply when she says to Ilioneus that these shores are immanibus, immanes, kind of savage, that the local inhabitants are different from the Phoenicians. This is also what Venus says when she does this, Venus in the second passage talking to Aeneas, telling him that on the one hand there is this Phoenician city, and then at its borders there are the Libyans, a race impossible to handle in war. And it's a line that will be actually reused by Dido's sister Anna in Aeneid 4. And Dido herself seems to be, when we talk about kind of colonization, there's a lot of emphasis perhaps on the Romans sort of colonizing Dido's history, but Dido herself in her own history, if we're talking about kind of violent colonizers, had some violent episodes in her bag. So Justin tells us, for instance, that she abducted 80 virgins from the island of Cyprus and she gave them in marriage to Tyrian youths. Also because then she would buttress this idea of Carthage as not needing the local inhabitants afterwards. And she talks in the Aeneid about her father, Belus, who laid waste Vastabat, the island of Cyprus, as a conqueror as well. And she seems to be kind of following in his footsteps. And in Book 4, at the beginning of Book 4, Anna's sister tells Dido that part of the reason why a possible marriage with Aeneas is useful is precisely to have some extra protection against the people who surround her. And in comparison to Venus, who had made everyone a Libyan, Anna actually distinguishes between different people. So now it's the Getulians who are the people who are unconquerable in war. And then she mentions also the Numidians and the Barcae. And it's quite interesting that the Barcae obviously kind of evoke the line of Hannibal Barca. But it's quite interesting that both of them are described with terms that in the book will actually be applied to Dido herself. So the Numidians are described as unbridled, technically because they practice bare horse riding, but infreni is also a word that denotes kind of luxurious attitudes, say. And the Barcae are described as furentes, out of their mind as well, as furious, which is a word that obviously furor will be applied throughout the Book 4 to Dido. So there is a point in which, in Book 4, it seems as if Dido is moving towards the local Africans somehow. There is at some point, she she seems to assimilate from the very beginning, assimilate some stereotypical traits of the local Africans. And I think that this is most clear in her encounter with a Massilian sacerdos, a Massilian priest, which is a really strange scene. No, I don't have time to go into this in any detail, I think. But it's an interesting passage because this Massilian, so the priestess was Massila, which means that she came from the borders, more or less, of Carthage. But then she was sent to Ethiopia to guard the serpent of the Hesperides. So actually the serpent it's also really strange because the serpent is meant to guard the apples of the tree, and then she is meant to guard the apples from the serpent. So it's a strange passage. And Dido says that she is using this magic rites against her will, and it's all kind of this priestess's fault if she's engaging in this kind of, well, we could say black magic in a sense. And then when the rites are described, it's what happens between Dido and the priestess is that they seem to fuse into the same person. And this is not as clear, I think, in the English, but in the Latin, line 509, Crinis effusa sacerdos, it could be Dido and the priestess with her disheveled hair, or it could be Dido as a priestess, herself as the priestess, also because there seems to be like a similarity between that line and a line later, 517, where it's actually Dido is again next to the altars, and she took her meal in her hands and she's worshipping. She's taking the meal around. So again, it's a really complicated passage, but it's one of these passages where she seems to kind of really mingle with sort of local rites. So I think I will stop here because I wanted to ask you a couple of things. I only have 2 slides just to show you the sort of reception that Dido could have from a racial point of view, or she did have most recently. This is not necessarily a reception of Dido, but it's a character. It's a character who was called Dido Elizabeth Bell, of whom we know very little, except that she was portrayed in this portrait with her cousin Elizabeth Murray. We know that she was born. She was the daughter of a British naval officer and of an enslaved woman in the West Indies, and then she was taken back home and she was raised by her uncle William Murray, who was important in terms of who was the first to say that slavery did not abide to rules of common law on one specific case. And there was a film, I don't know if any of you have seen it. It's not called Dido, interestingly. It's called Belle, because they wanted to use the name of the mother for the film. And scholars have been wondering why this woman was called Dido. And there are different ideas. One is maybe that she was called after the ship that brought her back from the West Indies. Another is that perhaps her uncle, who was clearly knowledgeable of classical literature, decided to call her Dido. So different scholars have proposed different ideas for this character. And then a more clear example, I think, is production, pre-pandemic production of Dido, Queen of Carthage by Christopher Marlowe from the Royal Shakespeare Company, which staged actress Chipo Chung as Dido, who is particularly interested in questions of kind of being mixed race, but also being herself having lived as a refugee. So she was particularly interested in the story, and she released some interviews, and I just have a snippet here, but interviews in which she talks about why, for her, Dido can speak to these kind of interests, and why, when she saw a previous production of Christopher Marlowe's Dido, she was unsatisfied with the kind of potential that Dido had to speak outside white audiences. So I have a bibliography. I'll just leave it here, perhaps. And I'm happy for Paul maybe to send it to you if you're interested afterwards. So thank you for listening. And I would be really interested in hearing thoughts, questions, criticism, whatever. Yeah? Hi.
We haven't kind of touched on the scene with Dido in the underworld. With
yeah, you're right.
My students are, every year they suddenly decide, oh no, it's a happy ending after all, so no, this is, she's clothed so yeah. How's that gone down in the reception of how the story is perceived?
Yeah, I mean, in Marilu Oliva, I read it. It's interesting because it's the other way around, that it's Aeneas was really angry because she killed him, basically. But he's there with Creusa, and she's like, oops, I didn't do it on purpose. Anyway, that's there. In the critical reception, I think it's an amazing passage because there is I don't have the passage, unfortunately, with me, but there is an ambiguity that is often commented upon. There's a line that says something like, and the tears fell on the cheeks. And it's really not clear whose tears those are. And to me, it's one of the, many are the best lines of the Aeneid, I think. But it's one of those moments where really there's, it's the emotions of both come to the surface, that they both could potentially become protagonists in a sense of the story. The both of them suffered in the story. So that's for the critical reception. I don't know, I don't remember if in terms of other receptions, because obviously the reception of Dido focused a lot on book 4, right? So if you have like plays such as Christopher Marlowe, etc., they would leave that bit out. But it's interesting that they find that is a happy ending. That she's staring at the floor like an Ajax, right? That's.
You could try and read it that she's back to him. That's where it should have been.
Yeah.
She's got this wound fresh, and if she's in the underworld, will she stay like that?
Yeah. I think if you go back to so the model is the encounter with Ajax, right, in the underworld, where Ajax clearly is unhappy. And Ajax is a model, obviously, for Dido in other respects, for Dido's suicide. So I suppose that has to play some role in it. She's also, I think the line of her, like, looking back is also taken from Athena, Minerva, on the temple scenes in the Aeneid, as like a goddess who's angry at what is happening at Troy. And when she's not answering to the Trojan mother's prayers. I don't know what we can do with that sort of intertext. And there's this very strange thing also, that the line that Aeneas says to her, invitus regina tuo delitore cessi, I left your shore unwillingly. It's a line that it's modeled on a poem originally by Callimachus, but we have it in the translation of Catullus, and that's the lock of hair of Queen Berenice, who was a Cyrenian queen who married into the Ptolemies family. And it's quite unclear why Aeneas would speak like the lock of hair of Berenice. But there may be some have suggested that because Dido is a bit like Cleopatra, it's kind of evoking this Egyptian context. But it's a really strange moment, I think. Sorry, I haven't answered your question, but sorry, hi.
Most of my students, when we study this, they just feel sympathy for Dido the entire time, especially.
Okay.
Even on the issue of her falling in love with Aeneas, they're very quick to point out that she was kind of under a spell anyway by Aeneas and Juno. So, how do you reconcile the sympathy that we feel for Dido with all these anti sentiments that are
Yeah.
very interestingly brought out. I've never spotted this before. It's like,
Yeah.
but if she's supposed to be a figure of hate or prejudice, why do we feel so sorry for her?
Yeah, that's why I don't agree with Nicholas Horsfall at all. I mean, I think it's an important... I mean, clearly this must have been somehow in the background. But I think that's what I was trying to say, that I think that Virgil, he always... he never claims it for the story, right? It's always, okay, Venus thinks that the Carthaginians are like that. Jupiter thinks that. Everyone, and it's part of this. She is framed by the gods, and the gods were kind of causing the Roman Empire then to exist for the destruction of Carthage as well. But I don't think that the text itself supports this at all. There is another passage that I haven't mentioned when she wishes she had a child with Aeneas, which I think is a moment of absolute pathos. Many of the scholars read it as, what would she have done to that? Because the Carthaginians were renowned for child sacrifice. And I can see that, that maybe perhaps some, that maybe Virgil could be playing with these expectations of Carthaginians, but it's not necessarily the Dido that he's writing about who should comply or not to these expectations. I don't know if you maybe you have an answer to that. Or